brought forward by various countries in these negotiations, and that explain why these negotiations are so difficult. Because depending on how you see and interpret certain facts, your answer and your position is very different, and that's what we see. So, and this question I divided in two sub-questions. If you want to determine what's fair, what kind of deal is fair for everyone, I come to this question first. So, looking at who caused climate change, because in a fair world, you would ask the polluter to pay. So the one who is responsible for climate change would also need to take care of cleaning it up and addressing it. But that argument sounds very easy, but it actually is not. It's very much contested who is responsible, to what extent, for what. And that's where we come in these political interpretations. And also a question that is very relevant is, can you actually hold someone responsible for greenhouse gas emissions that they emitted at a time when it was not known that climate change has happened, is happening, and when the consequences of their action were not known. And of course, this links to the very complex question of whether greenhouse gases that occur in one country, but that are actually made or emitted because they produce a product that's consumed in another country, is that not fair if these emissions go on the account of this one country while the consumption and the benefit is enjoyed in another country? So here again already determining who causes climate change actually is not that easy and is very much debated. The second question that I think is very important if you want to determine what kind of deal, what kind of fair deal should we strike, is who suffers or who suffers most from climate change. Because here again, it's not necessarily the same people who cause climate change who are also the ones who are very much affected by the impact of climate change. So the impact might occur in a different country than where the emissions are emitted, and that's what we already heard as well. So it seems very logical that the people who suffer from climate change should be supported by the rest of the world or by the countries that emit these greenhouse gases. But then again, if you only hold the ones who are emitting or emitting most responsible, how do you deal with that question of the countries who are currently not emitting so much, but if you anticipate their growth and their growing emissions with that? So here again, a very complex question and very different views on how exactly to determine the answer to that one. And I brought one example to illustrate this question of people suffering who don't necessarily cause climate change so much. This is a photo from Bangladesh, flooding in Bangladesh, which is a country that to 80% of its territory actually lying below 1 meter above the sea level. So Nicole spoke about 20 centimeters sea level rise in the Antarctic. Imagine the sea level rise is significantly there. They're hit very hard. They're extremely vulnerable to climate change. While if you look at their greenhouse gas emissions per capita, the Belgian emissions per capita are 9 times higher than the ones in Bangladesh. So here, this is really a country that would argue, or that it's in favor of a very strong agreement, and that would suffer very much from our action or action on it. And this also shows that both mitigation of climate change, but also adaptation to climate change is very important. They're both two sides of the same coin in these negotiations. So if we now look here, Bangladesh doesn't seem to be the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. But who is it then? And I brought that slide. This is from 2013. And I don't need to read out. So here we see that actually if you would take together China, the US, and I couldn't find one with the EU, but the EU currently is about 10% just below. Just correct me if I'm wrong. So if you would take the three together, China, the US, and the EU, you have half of the world's emission. Should that be enough? Should the three of them take action? Probably not enough. You probably need the entire world because, and we heard that reasoning very much. Unilateral action, of course, might potentially just increase the emissions from the rest that's not committed to any serious reduction targets. So, but if you look at this picture as well, it would only seem fair that China would mitigate to a significant extent, because here, according to these figures, it's the largest emitter. If we now move to this, it looks a bit different already. So these are the cumulative emissions between 1990 and 2011. And there, the Chinese share is already a bit smaller, the US a bit bigger, and here we have the EU, it's also a bit bigger. And if you take or if you draw conclusions based on this, your conclusions as to who should have which responsibility might be different. And the picture changes even more if you look at this figure. These are now cumulative emissions between 1850 and 2011. And here, yeah, as Europeans, we have a bigger share, the US as well, and basically the EU and the US make up half of global, or more than half of global emissions. So your conclusions drawn from this, based on historical responsibility, yet again, are different. And these are arguments that are very much present in the negotiations and put forward by certain countries that would look very good according to this chart. But this also links to what I mentioned earlier. We only know since the 1990s or 1980s that humans are actually contributing to climate change. So often the 1990 year is taken as a baseline year for calculating reductions and the like, because that's when the first, when the IPCC first really submitted very solid data showing that humans are causing climate change or contributing to climate change. Okay, so based on these figures or these charts, you could assume, yes, every country needs to do its share, needs to contribute. But this is not necessarily how we have addressed it in the past. And I brought one map that shows the Kyoto Protocol and the countries that committed to reducing greenhouse gases in the Kyoto Protocol. This was adopted in 1997. And here you see that there was a distinction. The green ones are what we call Annex 1 countries, so countries that actually had full or relatively strong commitments to reduce greenhouse gases domestically. The yellow ones is economies in transition. They also committed to reductions, but there was a bit more flexibility for them. And then the large share of the red ones are countries that that did not make any commitment. So the old world, or the world of the Kyoto Protocol, really shows a few countries making some commitments and the other ones not. But now with the emissions, as I showed you earlier, rising very much in these red countries, this is not the situation that we can continue, because it won't help solve the problem that we're addressing. And that's also shown very much by this graph. It's just a few countries, but I guess China is just the most illustrative one. Since the early 2000s, its emissions really increased tremendously. So if you would strike a deal along the lines of the Kyoto Protocol and these countries out, we would not necessarily achieve the goal that we're setting out to achieve. So, but the big question that arises from that is, can we, the Western countries actually have achieved high levels of prosperity while emitting greenhouse gas emissions. So can we now deny other countries the same trajectory? Can we deny them the same level of wealth that we have? And, I have a couple more. That's very good. And I have here, it's just a slide of GDP per capita. And if you see, well, the same countries that were, or some of them that were red in the Kyoto Protocol world, they also have a very low GDP per capita. So a number of these countries still need to grow. They still need to grow to provide basic needs for their population, such as access to electricity. In some parts of Africa, that's really a problem where people don't necessarily have these basic supplies or this basic infrastructure. So there is some need in some countries certainly to still develop and grow. But the question is, how do we achieve a higher level of prosperity for them while still keeping our climate goals in mind? And the answer sounds easy, as many of the answers. It's low carbon and resilient growth. And I brought a few photos here of how it could work, of course. And I have your electric car there, so I'm happy that I chose that photo. But also, you know, decentralized solar electricity generation in, that was a photo from Ethiopia. And I think the other one is from South Africa, wind turbines. So basically it is possible and it is happening, but it often costs more money. And that also links very much to Steph's explanations. So here there is a clear need for climate finance, and that's one of the key issues, or one of the big topics that will be discussed in Paris as well. Climate finance for countries that actually want to develop in a low carbon resilient way, but that don't necessarily have the technology, as you mentioned, but also the finance. So, yeah, another very key aspect to which hopefully in Paris an agreement or a solution will be found. Good. This concludes my some insights on why the arguments differ or why it's so complicated to find an agreement between the different countries. But what could a solution look like? And I brought one which I found interesting, but not necessarily realistic. But I thought everyone knows Thomas Piketty. He spoke here not that long ago about his book Capital in the 21st Century. But he actually, meanwhile, also has a report on climate change, where he proposes, as the title says, that actually CO2 emissions should be taken into account at an individual level rather than at a country level. That would avoid problems of carbon leakage. This problem is that carbon emissions for our consumption might occur somewhere else because the production is taking place in other countries. And it has some interesting thoughts or interesting ideas, but I'll also tell you in a second why I don't think that that's a very realistic proposal. But first I have a few quotes from the launch of this report. So that's Piketty himself. He basically argues in this report, together with his co-author, that individuals, not states, should be charged for the CO2 that they emit. So then also, the ones who consume more oil and the bigger cars pay more, and it's the fairest you could imagine, possibly. But what I also found interesting at the same launch, there was an Indian researcher who, made strong statements. And one of them is that he said we must put an end to environmental colonialism. Individuals have a right to development wherever they are. So, this argument that I mentioned earlier, that it's very difficult to deny growth, to deny prosperity to some countries, say you can't have the same as we had and achieved in the past. And this one also, was, I can't be but he said the problem is that the United States will manage to get the total lack of ambition accepted in the Paris Agreement, which means that Africa and India will have no room for development. So clearly you see here that these lines that I lined out earlier in these elements come out in the rhetoric of some people very strongly. Okay, so that leads me to my last slide and back to my question. Having looked at all of these elements, figures, arguments, what is it then? What's a fair deal? What are they talking about in Paris very soon? And one point that I'd like to stress, and that really contradicts the slides that I had earlier about Piketty's study or proposal, countries and governments do play a big role. And they do play a big role also because they regulate production, they provide incentives for production. I don't necessarily believe that individuals and the demand that they create will have the power to shift industry and production processes to the extent that we will need to address climate change. Then the second big element, I mentioned that already, that will be discussed and that can be one of the make or break deals, is climate finance. Who's going to provide how much to whom, and also linking that to technology transfer and similar questions. This point will now be addressed by just a bit more, I suppose. So we now really have a much more bottom-up process, and we're trying to go for regular reviews. So not the Kyoto top-down, few countries do something, but much more generating support, asking countries to come forward with their pledges, and then see how far we get to have more buy-in by all countries, and not just a few. And the last point, and I assume that's going to come up more in just a bit as well, is transparency. If you want to strike a fair deal, if you want to calculate or assess what is fair, who does what, who should receive how much money, you actually need to know how much everyone emits, you need to know how much everyone causes or contributes to climate change, and how much everyone suffers from it, and what kind of benefit they incur. So this leads me to the end of what I wanted to talk about, and I guess I hope it's a good transition to just a bit, who will elaborate a number of these points more.